I'm R.R. Moore, and welcome to Info Prime. Here I hope to provide you with information not normally available, or at least enhance your understanding on a wide variety of topics. This installment offers information on Welcome to the United States of America, The Real History, Episode 3, A Short History of Slavery in America. Let's jump right into the timeline. The very first slave ship arrived in what would become America in 1619. It landed in Jamestown, Virginia. It was a Dutch ship which had aboard what was termed 20-odd African slaves. 20-odd meant around 20. The ship, the White Lion, had been in a battle with a Spanish ship, won the battle, and took aboard their own ship, the Africans. The Dutch traded the Africans for supplies in Jamestown. There were no slaves in America at that time, so the Africans became indentured servants. By definition, indentured servants had to spend 7 years working for whomever had purchased them. After the 7 years, they were set free, truly free to own land, pursue their dreams, and all that freedom entails. Slavery started in Africa itself by Africans. Upon winning a battle with another tribe, the winning tribe would take the losing peoples as slaves. In this specific case, the winning Africans had sold their slaves to Muslims who were in the business of slavery. The Muslims, in turn, sold their slaves to the Spanish ship's owners. Again, there was no such thing as slavery in America. It would be some 36 years before the very first true slave would emerge. Before proceeding, I would like to do a slight aside here. We would like to think that slavery was something that happened hundreds of years ago and does not affect us today. We would also like to think that the current state of today's civilization across the world was such that we would not be plagued with slavery. We would be wrong. Take a look at this. This is a partial list of nations in the world where slavery today operates unfettered by laws and in fact is systemic to the nation's culture. In addition, the rights of women, for all intents and purposes, do not exist in these nations. And if you think slavery does not exist here in our country today, as well as in the Western world in general, you would be wrong again. Some seem to think that the term human trafficking sounds better than slavery. But slavery it is, pure and simple. For a small example, go to Google and look up sex slavery in the USA, Atlanta, Georgia, and see what you get. This, again, is but a sample. Of course it's illegal here, but still goes on. We might ask why. Probably for the same reasons that gangs are allowed to terrorize the less affluent parts of our society and ply the drug trade border to border and coast to coast. It's called follow the money. Well, that's enough of that. Now back to our real history timeline. The first actual slave in America was named John Kaser. His owner, as it were, was Anthony Johnson. You might be surprised to learn that Anthony Johnson was a black man. Yes, the first owner of human beings in our country was himself black, who owned blacks. Johnson arrived in this country basically as a slave brought from Angola. But remember, when he arrived, there was no slavery, only indentured servitude. So Johnson, after serving his 7 years working on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, became a free man. It was often customary for a newly freed indentured servant to be granted land of his own, and so it was with Johnson. He was granted 250 acres of farmland. Over time, he became very successful and actually became known as the Black Patriarch of the first Negro community of property owners in America. In the early 1650s, there was a dispute between Johnson and another landowner over John Kaser, an indentured servant working for Johnson. This dispute went to court in the Northampton, Virginia court. Johnson finally won the dispute with the court awarding Johnson casus service for life. From 1655 until the start of the Civil War, slavery greatly expanded, north as well as in the South. The majority of slaves, of course, were held in the South, as the growing season there is much longer than the North. An interesting note is that fewer than 25% of Southerners owned slaves. Only the very wealthy could afford the luxury, as it were. Unless one was very wealthy, you lived not much better than slaves, if that well. Scratching for a living was hard in those days. Many whites in the South existed as sharecroppers, which amounted to basically being an indentured servant by another name. However, for me, and for the slaves as well, I'm sure, I would rather be hungry and free than well-fed and a slave. The morality of slavery was hotly debated both in the North and in the South. Almost no one thought that slavery was moral, but the economics of cheap labor seemed to win every time. There was even a move favored by many, including Abraham Lincoln, called colonization. Its purpose was to send the blacks back to Africa. This purpose, far from being due to hatred of blacks, was viewed as more humane than slavery. The widespread feeling of the day was that blacks couldn't and never would meld into the American culture. Therefore, it would be more humane to allow blacks to return to their homeland and to their culture. This was not some backwater feeling. Many believed in this idea. There was even a society established for this purpose. It was called the American Colonization Society, or ACS. It had 218 local auxiliary chapters and thousands of supporters. There were quite a few major political hitters of the day who believed in the goals of the ACS. You can see a few on the chart up now. And today, the next fact sounds like something from Ripley's Believe It or Not. A colony was established in what is now Liberia, Africa, for a home for those to be colonized. Its capital, Monrovia, was named after President James Monroe. The ACS wasn't disbanded until 1964. As those in Canada would say, incredible, eh? So the Civil War was fought and won to preserve the Union and partially to eliminate slavery. For more on that, watch episode 2 of this series. Right after the war, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to our Constitution. And a mere 5 years after that, the 15th Amendment was ratified to allow blacks to vote. What followed was a long period of discrimination against blacks. They had the right to vote, but they still had a long way to go. One discrimination tactic was the poll tax. Remember, back then there was no such thing as income tax. This didn't come into being until 1913. Monies to run the government and defend the country back then came mainly from sales taxes and property taxes. And there were many people, not just blacks, who did not own property. The thought then was that if one didn't have any skin in the game, or owned no property and thus paid no taxes, why should one be allowed to vote for those who ran the government and defended our country? So the poll tax was invented. Anyone, again, not just blacks, who did not own property was required to pay a poll tax in order to register to vote. It was obviously another form of tax. A typical poll tax of the day was about $1, around $18 in today's money. As the vast number of blacks were poor, this amounted to not allowing them to vote, 15th Amendment or not. Of course this was viewed as discrimination, but more than just blacks were affected. Another form of discrimination was called separate but equal. Segregation was a part of this. Blacks and whites had separate restaurants, separate restrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate areas in which they lived, and separate schools, to name a few. They were separate, all right, but seldom equal. This was true discrimination, and it would last quite a while. There was more to discrimination, of course, but I think you get the picture. Curiously, even today, there are cries of discrimination by some government officials and some of the more controversial black leaders. These cries center around voter ID laws. It is offered that voter ID laws discriminate against blacks and the poor in general due to the costs associated and logistics of obtaining such an ID. Horse feathers, I say. Anyone who can prove citizenship can obtain an identification free in all 50 states. And by the way, as a U.S. citizen, try voting in Mexico or Canada without being one of their citizens and see what happens. Consider further, there are an estimated 14 million illegal immigrants living in our country right now today. With no requirement to prove citizenship, the floodgates to voter fraud and all kinds of corruption are opened. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. This outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and in facilities that serve the general public. A year later, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. This did away with the poll tax. And now you know the real history. Wait a minute. There's another aspect to discrimination that we haven't addressed. Maybe it will offer a comparison to what we have addressed. Let's go back to our timeline for just a moment. Remember, blacks got the right to vote in 1870, 5 years after they obtained their freedom. But what you possibly fail to note, that this right to vote was for men of all races. It said nothing about women. Women of all races had to wait another 50 years to obtain the right to vote. This happened in 1920. Remember from episode 1 of this series, the U.S. Constitution was ratified way back in 1788. Therefore, women had to wait 132 years after we officially became a nation of our own to be able to vote. That also was real and true discrimination. Hi again. I hope this installment has been beneficial to you, and thanks for watching.